All right, everyone, welcome back. We're in reading George Orwell's 1984, second class on this topic. And last time I just broke the ground on the book. It's actually hard to lecture on a novel because it's long, and how to engage with a novel is very different than engaging with a poem. Poems are actually more highly structured and more there's more conspicuous artifice in the construction of a story, and so you can speak about the construction of the story. Whereas a narrative, it's first of all because it's longer, but also because it seems less structured. It can be challenging to actually know how to begin and where to come at it from. But I would say, roughly speaking, because this falls into three parts. There's part one, part two, part three. That in the first part, we're setting the stage. It's the setup for the novel. It's talking about the setting, which we got into a little bit last time. So he creates the mood and the sense of menace, and introduces some of the characters and the language and the themes. They're introduced in that sense. So he's setting the stage, or we can call it the setup. In part two, we get the conflict being described, and the combatants go to war with one another. Like we saw it last time when we began, that Winston Smith is the hero of sorts, the last European man, to use the title that George Orwell didn't use in the end. And his opponent is Big Brother. And Big Brother is a representation of the state. And so we got the individual, we got David and Goliath, if you will. We have an individual, we have this great mass represented by a figure of Big Brother, and I like this one better. The slogans here: war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength, written on the side of this, and Big Brother watching here on the billboard give a sense of the omnipresence of his opponent. No matter where he looks, his opponent is there. And that omnipresent sense is what gives us the sense that this is an impossible task for him to accomplish. When David meets Goliath, he goes out to the battlefield. When he finishes the battle, he can go back home. And there's a sense that there is a home. And he can retreat from the battle. He can go out to meet his opponent, and his opponent's there, and his opponent is far superior to him in size, strength, etc. But there's nonetheless it's a limited venue of confrontation. Whereas here, no matter where Winston Smith is, Big Brother is there. He's in his room of his house. He's in the hallways. He's everywhere he goes. So it's omnipresent. So it's the threat, and the magnitude of the threat seems far greater than the heroes of old had ever confronted, even in biblical or classical ages. Yes, comment, question.
Yeah, just a comment. Talking about the omnipresence, it also seems like there's the party's trying to put this sense of omniscience as well.
Yes.
With it saying oh, you never know if they're not listening or they're not watching.
Yes.
And, even with the thought police, their thoughts, it seems like such an unsurmountable
the odds are impossible.
Yeah.
And the omnipresence of the state is enhanced by what you just said, the omniscience. It seems to be everywhere and to know everything. And furthermore, to determine the past, the present, and the future. So it almost does have divine qualities and projects that sort of power into the mind of the reader. And again, if we want to go back to the beginning of this course, the Odyssey, how different that is from the beginning. Well, there at the beginning, we know what the venue of conflict is, again, because the gods themselves, the Olympian gods, talk about it. It's, oh, look at, here's Odysseus, and he's not yet returned from the Trojan War. And this is a terrible thing, because he's been a devout, pious man, and he's always paid homage to the gods. He's shown us that he's a good man, and yet he's suffering terrible consequences. He's hidden away on the island of Ogidja in the middle of nowhere. And he needs to come home. It's unjust that this should happen. So we see the God's eye viewpoint there in the Odyssey, and yet the gods seem to be limited in their situation, and even limited in their power in some way. Whereas here, the gods or the state seems to be everywhere, and at the same time, and this is what's particularly insidious, it seems to be nowhere. It's a faceless bureaucracy. And that in itself is rather terrifying, because with the Olympian gods, at least you have a sense of the gods represented by, a name. Zeus, you can appeal to Zeus. You can put up a statue of Zeus, whatever. There's an appeal to the deity, and you can assuage the deity, placate it through burnt offerings, whatever. Here there's a sense of, well, who do I actually come to speak to on this? And there seems to be no one. There's power without accountability, or even a person there. It's faceless. There is a face to it, as I say, the face of Big Brother, but we don't actually meet Big Brother, and we read actually in the accounts that there is no Big Brother. It's a creation of the state. And so it's a form of propaganda. And that's one of the more insidious aspects of the whole novel, is not only the omniscience and the omnipotence of the state, which is projected to us, but also the sense that the truth is not knowable here, because language itself has been controlled by the state. And there's no independence of that. Even the thoughts of the characters and their utterances are controlled. You can't even have your own thoughts. Or if you do, you might betray them through a gesture, because you're being watched. And so there's a sense of terror that accompanies the beast of the state here, which, again, if you want to pull back then from a Christian perspective, seems to suggest the advance of the realm of the forces of evil in a way that is unprecedented in the literature that we've read, perhaps even in human history. If you want to look in biblical accounts, look at the rise of Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel. He builds a great statue to himself, demands worship of himself. Same thing with Caesar, Augustus Caesar, in the time of the Roman Empire, claims divinity for himself, demands that everyone worship him as a god, and the early Christians refused to do so, saying there's only one Lord, and his name is Jesus Christ. We will not take a pinch of incense and say Caesar is Lord. We won't do it. There's only one Lord. So whereas here, who is the alternative God to the state? Even. This is a man in what's his name? Winston Smith, who acknowledges no God. He's literally helpless. There is only the God of the state, and there is no other God here, and he is naked and in the dark as a consequence of it. He's feeble and helpless, and yet he's the hero. He's Orwell's hero. And Orwell himself, as a man, was pretty strongly anti-Christian. He's certainly anti-Catholic. He went to Eton College. He was educated in that fashion and so forth, but he was very much a man of the political left. He was opposed to totalitarian Stalinist policies, but he more or less believed in democratic socialism, but he had no God that he believed in, and yet he faced the seeming omniscience and omnipotence of the state. What does a man without a God to believe in, how can he stand against such power? And the answer here is he can't and he doesn't. But we wish that he could. And so we're sort of cheering with Winston Smith, hoping that he might just summon a means of getting out of the dilemma that he's in. But that's the stage that we see in part one, is Winston Smith against God. When I say God, you've taken what I've said about that there is no God here, but it's the state, and it's Big Brother, and it's all around him. And so we're naturally drawn to his side because, again, the God that's portrayed here is only a God because of power, not because of goodness. This is not a benevolent God. On the contrary, it seems to be the exact opposite. This is a God that is hostile to humanity. Everything human is opposed by the power of this beast that he faces. If you read Easter 1916, or The Second Coming by our Irish poet friend, it talks about this slow beast whose slow thighs move towards Bethlehem. And that sense of the ominous growth of religious power is a part of 20th century fiction and politics. And we get, for the first time, now I'm talking outside the novel now and talking more about 20th century, the development of the 20th century, a growth in atheism and atheistic regimes. In communist regimes are all atheistic. And they strongly mistreat Christians, whether it's in the Soviet Union or whether it's in communist China or whether it's anywhere communism is and there's a official declared atheism. Those who are committed to another god are treated extraordinarily badly. They're murdered, they're humiliated, they're treated in the same fashion here as Winston Smith. So Winston Smith, in a sense, represents that, some sort of opposition to the totalitarian state. And we wish that it were not so. So we're thrown to his side. But does George Orwell have an antidote to this? And the answer is he doesn't. It's just despair. And that's the climate of the 20th century. And I would say even the 21st century. We're not, are we away from that? I mean, I don't sense it. I don't sense a great resurgence of hope. The 19th century concludes with hope in humanity. It's progressivism. It's hope in progress and the advance of civilization, and we're going to bring about a transformation of the earth, bring out about a new heaven and a new earth through scientific innovation, through technology, through rational ordering of society. There's a great deal of optimism there, and it ends on the battlefield of World War I, when the European powers clash together and fight for 4 years over a patch of ground that's a couple miles long in Belgium. Trench warfare. These are the Christian European powers. They fight, and at the end of it all, they're broken, and they largely give in to nihilism and despair. North America's a couple of decades behind. Not quite there yet, but we're not far off that. Orwell is, some people say that the work is prophetic, and I know what they mean by that, because it seems to be looking forward. But it's not prophetic in the sense that, in the biblical sense of prophetic, the prophets don't only look forward into the future, they always call upon the people to look backward to who God is and how God has always acted, and reminds them, and they're always calling them back to the law of Moses. Right? Always. The prophet, in fact, that's his first call, is to call them backwards to remembrance. And only then to look at the future. And if you act in accordance with the God who acted here decisively in the Exodus event, you will recognize that God who is the same yesterday and forever will also be with you in the present. That then leads people to be able to hope in the future. But prophecy that looks forward without looking to a God who saves and acts is going to be ill-equipped to deal with any threat, let alone the totalitarian threat that Orwell describes. Does anyone have any comments about that? That seems to me to be evident in the story. I know some people love 1984 because it seems profound. I liked it when I read it in grade 12. I thought, there's something profound about this. Remember, this is the Cold War. But it seemed to me that, Orwell is, remember, he's depicting 3 different regions but none of them are good. And I'm reading it in Canada, and I'm thinking, okay, so the Soviet Union, those are the bad guys. And in Canada, well, I'm with the good guys. But then I look at what's happening in Canada, and are these really the good guys? Because they're also committed to what? What are they committed to which would make them good? I mean, are they promoting a culture of freedom and dignity? Do they value human life? Do they promote opposition to the state in any way or allow for the dissent of that? If they do, it's a pretty pale version of that. It seems to be a lot like a totalitarian society in many ways. Not totally there, but how far off is it? Anyway, comment or question?
You had said that leading up to World War One that there was hope and inspiration to come. What do you think has kept the world in a perpetuated state of despair and madness, rather than reverting or finding a way to go back to what it was before?
So I'm not quite sure. So in the light of the collapse of the progressive ideals for humanity, that is almost the cause of the rise of the nation state. So we can talk about, the United Kingdom and France and Germany and other countries historically, and we can date that back centuries. And we could talk about China having existed for thousands of years as well, and other countries, we can call them that. But the features of the modern nation state are different than just language and culture. There's a sense of people groups. And there's a biological turn to it in the late 18th, early 19th century that seems different. People started identifying themselves with their nations, and their nations seem to be connected with their biology in a way that you don't actually see historically in the same way. Let alone think that the story of the nations is one of, as a Darwinist will then put it, survival of the fittest, and only one nation is going to survive. That changes the calculation of the conflict between the nations. If only one of us is going to be left standing, then I guess we've got to win that fight, and it pushes us into the conflict. I mean, as a matter of survival, if we don't win it, then we're gone. So we have to win it. So we're all in. Now, if you then can point to your cultural artifacts, your weapons, your technology, your communications, your national character, and think that these are so advanced that you're going to defeat your enemies, and you better hope they do, because if they don't, you're crushed and gone, and all of the countries believe this, then I would say what they've done, first of all, is they've wedded Christianity with a worldliness which is totally contrary to the Christian faith, first of all. Secondly, they've invested in the idea of a nation, a form of identity which is opposed to the kingdom of God, which includes all nations and peoples and groups. Not exclusively one. It's not just Canada or the United States or Britain. Rule Britannia. Britannia rule the waves, right? And the British Empire that spread across the face of the world and brought Christianity with it has collapsed into perhaps a sort of a British national identity as the Christian one. But how about the other Christian nations? So that those themes they start to become more and more complicated. And especially then when you get, at least historically, Christian countries fighting against each other, not for supremacy, but for the sake of existence. And if you think those are the stakes going in, and by the way, you can look at the documents and leading up to world wars, all of the powers are from the pulpits. The pulpits are encouraging people to go to war, by and large. Go back and look at them. And now it's largely not, it's the establishment churches, because remember, the establishment churches are connected to the state, that are going to advance this as, if we win, then Christ wins. So they've collapsed the kingdom of God into the kingdom of the nations that they represent. And what ensues this is a huge loss of faith in what they believed in before. But what they believed in before was that actually a Christian thing, or they'd already abandoned it. I would say they'd already abandoned it. They'd already committed themselves to a worldliness that contradicted what Scripture says about the kingdom of God. And you could further trace that back to the way in which the Bible is read in the 18th century in the historical critical method, which reads it as a worldly text. But again, I'm stepping back from 1984 and giving it. But I want to do this on the course. Because in a sense, we're at the end of a full year, and think about how things have advanced over the course of now almost 6 months. It is 6 months, going on 7, almost through 7. And think a little bit about that. And George Orwell sees very clearly how dehumanizing the modern state is. It's like Big Brother, it's like the face of a boot smashed upon a human face forever. There's a good image of what Big Brother wants to do. Now, his friend and former teacher, Aldous Huxley, will say that's not what the future is going to look like. The future is going to look like the way I've depicted it. The political elites are not going to smash us down and threaten us and terrorize us. They're going to induce us into thinking that we're getting something good for us. They're going to give us all the sex that we want, and they'll give us chemicals that'll make us aroused all the time and happy. We'll get a combination of Viagra and I don't know what it is that makes you feel happy all the time. Ecstasy. Yeah, you can have those. And that's the way they'll make everybody go along and not question. Yeah, whatever, marijuana. Yeah, the pot shops all around Toronto that just popped up overnight, suddenly. You can't actually see what's going on inside them. Are they money laundering places? You tell me. I never see anyone going into them. But there are thousands of them. How do they stay open? Got to pay Toronto taxes? How on earth? Yeah, but sure, we'll give you all the drugs you want on demand. And we'll do antenatal conditioning. We'll do conditioning before birth. And we'll do selective breeding or not. You don't have to have the family. The family is the forbidden word in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. You can't use the word family. That's been abolished. And never mind. But that's the conflict between the two of them. Is it going to come as in we're persuaded to dehumanize ourselves? That's Aldous Huxley. Or are we just going to be crushed by conditioners that don't even care about the humanity of their fellow human beings? That's Orwell's vision of the future. Not that long ago, I would have said Huxley is closer to accurate. People can be induced by pleasures to forfeit their humanity. That's how porn works. That's how drugs work. But Orwell's ominous 1984 seems to be more realistic to some people in times when liberties and rights are suddenly pulled off the table and ethics is thrown out the window, as it is in many countries. It's always the case. Well, it seems to have happened here as well. Anyway, that's a debate we can have. But what I think seems common to the two is that there is this sense of a bureaucracy, a faceless bureaucracy that you can't resist. You're hopeless and helpless. Now, I don't think even if we were saying that this is a realistic portrait, I don't think we're not in the situation of Winston Smith yet. I don't think that's the case. You're not an individual. You don't have such distrust that he has nobody to trust. Literally nobody. Now, there may be people that feel like that, but in general, I don't think that's the general situation here. But it is the situation there. And so then you can imagine, given your own experience as a reader, what it would be like if it continues on the same trajectory where the state keeps growing and its power keeps advancing in the name of protecting us and giving us security and safety, what will be the end of that whole process? And so that's why it seems very real and compelling. I don't know if you've thought otherwise. But that sense, again, that Big Brother is watching you, there's always a look over you. And again, you can see there's an anti-sex league here, but of course the woman with the anti-sex league is rather provocatively dressed. And then we get the brutish fellow here. I don't even know what he's wearing. What on earth is that? But let's not delve into an artist's representation of the scenes here. But it's not a tale of two cities. It was the best of times, it's the worst of times. It's just the worst of times. So it has that dystopian feature. Not an ideal future, but the exact opposite of that. It is a terrible future, and people don't even see it as fiction anymore. They see it as social commentary. For anybody in the 20th century and the 21st century, but particularly Christians, what is it about the nature of modernity and then with atheistic premises of the state that Christians can do to subvert or present an alternative to that will be compelling? Now, I can tell you two men who do present alternatives to it, and you will know them very well. One's name is C.S. Lewis, and another's name is J.R.R. Tolkien. They present the opposite. They're living at the same time as Orwell and Huxley, and they present alternative visions for the future and write in the same sort of genres as these two gentlemen are writing. Now, I'm not going to do them right now. I do that in a different class. But because these are the ones that you will read in universities, Huxley and Orwell, not Lewis and Tolkien. And we can talk about how, in a different context, how what Lewis and Tolkien offer is far more popular. 1984, you're reading it because it's been put on the class syllabus. Would you ever have read it if I didn't put it on the class syllabus or put it in your school, or it was not in your high school syllabus? I don't think so. No, never. I still think it's worth reading. But it's not, you're not going to come away with a spring in your step and feel happier and feel that there's meaning and purpose to your life, because what is depicted is a life devoid of meaning and purpose. It's all been taken away. And the odds are insurmountable. You read this and, you're thinking, I need some Viagra and whatever, marijuana or something, just as an antidote to all this. This is terrible. How awful is this? And then what I realized when I get the Viagra and the marijuana is that, well, now I've jumped into all this Huxley, and have I escaped the problem? No. But I feel better, so, oh, well, Again, that's despair has crept in. Sorry, I'm Masson commenting on a Viagra and marijuana. You weren't expecting that today. I wasn't expecting it either. It's bad. Being unscripted is not always good. So, and the slogans are ones in which note that everything that we would regard as truth that no longer has any purchase on reality. War is peace. I talked about that last time. If war is peace, the two are identical, in which case language doesn't make any sense anymore. If freedom is slavery, then we have categories that Scripture talks about as totally antithetical to one another that no longer apply in this world. For me, these are all opportunities for Christians to say, actually, freedom is the opposite of slavery, and here's why. And why is one superior to the other? Because the history of humanity is largely one of slavery. Most nations and cultures historically have practiced the institution of slavery, and they've carried on, and some of them have become very powerful. But were they liberating? Were they humanizing in any way? And what does it mean to be free then? There's a place where we can engage there. But then freedom actually has to exist. I think there's a lot of desire for freedom and peace. But anyway, That's where the stage was set last time. The confrontation, let me get to that. Is it listed in terms of chapters or not here? That's what I didn't like about this particular one. I talked about this as the confrontation. Oh, there it is, chapter 1. And it concludes, let me go, I'll come to the conclusion of part 2, or part 1 rather. Oh, this is the problem with this. Okay. And this was at the end of the first part. He'd received a little note slipped, Winston Smith, into his possessions here, and he's sort of hidden it away because he doesn't want to look at it under the guise of the telescreens, because then they'll see that a note has been written and they'll think that's already an illegal act. To pass the note and to receive it is likewise. If he doesn't hand the note in and betray the person who gave him the note, he's immediately going to be arrested. And so his choices are to hide it or to betray the person who gave him the note. And he doesn't want to betray the person who gave him the note. He wants to read it. And to his surprise, by the way, the person who gives him the note, this woman, he hates her guts because he thinks she's trying to trick him and betray him. Because remember, the context of the totalitarian state is that everyone suspects everyone else. It creates that sort of division in its rank. It's actually not all powerful. And this is part of what we know here, and this is part of what makes Winston Smith heroic to us, is that we realize that actually the state's projection of power and authority is not as great as they think. It is dependent on complicity of the population. And if people start dissenting and don't go along with that, suddenly it's robbed of all its power because it's just propaganda. It's BS. And if people go along with it, well then it will have the power that it says. But if suddenly people stop drinking the Kool-Aid and stop going along with that narrative, there's nothing to enforce it. They don't have as much power as they think they do. And we're hopeful. Winston Smith's little act of individual thought and action gives us hope that there will be others out there like that. And so when the lady slips him the paper, we think, there's another one. And you know what? There might be a whole army of them. We just don't know where they are because they're afraid of identifying themselves. And so when he starts reaching out to first her, and then they hope others, they're hopeful that maybe, or at least we, the reader, are hopeful that maybe this can be overturned, actually. Did you want to comment or question? I'm sorry. Okay. They are.
But like, or is it that they're being driven to a certain point where they flip that switch and then they're like, then they actually choose to hope instead of despair because there's clearly no reason to continue living if it is the way that it is. Like,
we're going to get into psychology here, and I'm no expert in it, but they exhibit one thing that people call the Stockholm syndrome. First of all, which is that they're beaten to the point where they love their jailer because they can't cope with it. And that's the way that, because of the human soul, we're not like animals. Animals don't have a sense of freedom and dignity, the sense of injustice the way we do. And we can be conditioned to it, but we're not conditioned to behave in the same way that an animal will be. We're conditioned with maltreatment to do something with it in a way different than an animal. Animal will just try to avoid it. An animal is not going to love the person with the stick, but human beings will do that. Because we have to, and I think it's one of the indications that human beings are different than animals, is that we're created by God to love God. It's a part of human nature that we have, that love drives us. We're driven to worship, and we either worship the Creator or we worship the creation, says Romans 1. And in this case, we're going to be driven to worship something within the creation, the state, and we're even going to love it. Why? Because it beats us, and we would rather love it rather than oppose it and be beaten by it. It's a strange aspect of human psychology, but it's called the Stockholm Syndrome. Yes?
You said like how the state's projection of power is only present with the complicity of the people.
Yep.
So the people are enforcing like the very thing they hate and kind of fear upon themselves because of like the manipulation of their individuality, right? Because like they're driven to seclusion and fear, and they won't act upon it because of the fear of like what might happen to me if I gather and go against the system, that they can't see past that and see what it could actually like the potential of. I don't know if you're getting that.
I am getting what you're saying. I think you're correct as well. If they could mobilize and they could find one another, then they could act collectively. Individually, it's impossible to face off against such a force. But if you could collectively gather and consider a course of action, then you could resist this. And what's interesting and rather terrifying about Big Brother is Big Brother wants to make it unthinkable to resist. It's not just to quash the resistance. They want to make it unthinkable, and they feel the need to eliminate the very possibility of thought crime. And that's why we get into the third act of the play, the part 3, into the resolution of the plot, which is the punishment of Winston Smith. It's horrifying. We'd hoped it would be otherwise. He's betrayed by the woman who loves him. So here's where I left off, and I didn't continue reading. He is doing his work, and he slides it in the pneumatic tube, and 8 minutes later, he readjusts his spectacles on his nose, sighed, and drew the next batch of work towards him with the scrap of paper on top of it. So he's been very careful about this. So it looks like he's looking at his work when in fact he's looking at the note. And finally he sees it, he flattened it out. On it was written in a large unformed handwriting, "I love you." For several seconds, he was too stunned even to throw the incriminating thing into the memory hole. When he did so, though he knew very well the danger of showing too much interest, he could not resist reading it once again, just to make sure that the words were really there. Well, why is he shocked? Well, one, because he's a really unhealthy specimen, about 39 years old, and this is a beautiful young woman. So that's one thing. But another, there's a declaration of love here, which is detached from sex. Sex is there all the time in some ways, but this is, she says, "I love you." And that seems to be also outside of the allowable discussion items. You can't speak in those terms. For the rest of the morning, it was very difficult to work. What was even worse than having to focus his mind on a series of niggling jobs was the need to conceal his agitation from the telescreen, because he's got to master even his demeanor. It's really hard to do. Control your face in front of an audience. Like, I'm terrible at it. My wife berates me all the time for this. If you don't like something, you don't have to make it so obvious. You're a really bad liar. And I think that's probably a good compliment, but I don't think it's meant as a compliment. You should be better at concealing your thoughts on this. And he is good at it because you have to survive there. You have to become a hypocrite. You better look like this on the outside. Yes.
It just seems to me like the whole property that's set in 1984 is almost purely, like it was designed from the beginning to not be able to oppose it anymore.
It's designed to make it impossible to resist. You know what it does? It just occurred to me while I was saying this, and it's related to the hypocrisy. It requires you to lie. And when you lie, you lose your moral integrity.
Right? What I was wondering was because you mentioned that there were other people that were spread around, that they wanted to resist the government?
Well, he thought there might be, and there was rumors that they might exist out there. And there's even a discussion of Goldstein and his. It's theoretical. Well, he doesn't know. He's hoping, and we're hoping with him that that might exist because we hate this situation that he's in. Recognize that it's at least similar to our own circumstances, and we think if he can get out of it, then we can get out of it. There's a little hope in that. So come on, we're with you. Please find somebody else, resist this, and overturn it all. Again, please, yes. She doesn't mean I hate you. Yes.
She could be saying that I hate you, but you don't actually know if you're not, like if there is no truth, and like if you're not truth at any time, then like you have no idea if it's either love or hate.
Well, he wouldn't, and so then it would depend on whether he judges that she loves him, and he would have to overcome his distrust. Well, he's not wrong that he knows that she slipped him the paper, but she could be trying to bring him down, right? So she's going to slip him this note, but the purpose of like, this is ludicrous. This is a beautiful young woman. I'm this horrid middle-aged man, and there's no chance that this is happening, but I really want it to be the truth. And so you're thinking, I don't know here. Is it what they call it, a honey trap? And the state's just trying to find people that will fall into this, and they're trying to get me. So now he's in the terrible dilemma. He wants it to be true, but he's also wary that this is the way in which they're going to get me. And so there's that terrible personal conflict within him. All of his hopes might be there, and yet all of the greatest possible threat is just passed into his life. And so he has a great deal of difficulty, and he felt as though a fire were burning in his belly. Lunch in the hot, crowded, noise-filled canteen was torment. He had hoped to be alone for a little while during the lunch hour, but as bad luck would have it, the imbecile Parsons flopped down beside him, the tang of his sweat almost defeating the tinny smell of stew, and kept up a stream of talk about the preparations for Hate Week. And he was particularly enthusiastic. Parsons is a fool. And he's totally enthusiastic about he's the chief prisoner in the Stockholm Syndrome. He loves Big Brother. Like full-on love of Big Brother. And the afternoon is more bearable, but then as he goes down, he wolfs a tasteless meal. His soul writhed with boredom, but for once he had no impulse to shirk his evening at the center. At the sight of the words, I love you, the desire to stay alive had welled up in him. Okay, there you go. It's given him hope. And not hope in the girl even, per se, but hope to stay alive, which he didn't have before. And that's interesting as well. And I think very realistic on Orwell's part. There's a sort of sense of life and purpose and meaning that comes from, remember for Adam, it's not good to be alone. The creation of Eve, and there's a sense of personal fulfillment, completion, life that comes from Eve, whose name means life. And the taking of minor risks suddenly seems stupid. It was not, and he becomes bolder, but bolder means more foolish. He doesn't care as much. He's become more admirable. So just the mere hint that someone might love him leads him to exhibit a sort of extraordinary courage that he lacked before. And again, for those of us in the Western tradition that know how love transforms people, you can see that old theme arising here and the hope that comes with it. It was not till 23 hours when he was at home and in bed, in the darkness, where you're safe even from the telescreen, so long as he kept silent, that he was able to think continuously. It was a physical problem that had to be solved. How to get in touch with the girl and arrange a meeting. He did not consider any longer the possibility that she might be laying some kind of trap for him. He knew that it was not so because of her unmistakable agitation when she'd handed him the note. Okay, so he's reading her body language. Obviously, she'd been frightened out of her wits, as well she might be, nor did the idea of refusing her advances even cross his mind. He thought of her naked, youthful body as he'd seen it in his dream. He had imagined her a fool like all the rest of them, her head stuffed with lies and hatred, her belly full of ice. A kind of fever seized him at the thought he might lose her, the white, youthful body might slip from him. What he feared more than anything else was that she would simply change her mind if he didn't get in touch with her quickly. I better hurry up. So just boom, gone. All of his reservations, fears, all gone. Really interesting. And obviously the kind of encounter that happened this morning could not be repeated. And on and on. And the next day she appeared. Her arm was out of the sling, and she had a band of sticking plaster around her wrist. The relief of seeing her was so great that he could not resist staring directly at her for several seconds. Very dangerous. On the following day, he very nearly succeeded in speaking to her. It's like a high school crush. When he came into the canteen, she was sitting at a table well out from the wall and was quite alone. It was early and the place was not very full. The queue edged forward till Winston was almost at the counter, was held up for 2 minutes because someone in front was complaining that he had not received his tablet of saccharin. But the girl was still alone. When Winston secured his tray, began to make up for her table, he walked casually towards her, his eyes searching for a place at some table beyond her. She was perhaps 3 meters away from him. After another 2 seconds would do it. Then a voice behind him called, "Smith." He pretended not to hear. "Smith," repeated the voice more loudly. It was no use. He turned around. A blonde-headed, silly-faced young man named Wilshire, whom he barely knew, was inviting him with a smile to a vacant place at his table it was not safe to refuse. After having been recognized, he could not go at the table and sit with an unattended girl. It was too noticeable, so he sits down. The silly blonde face beamed into his. Winston had a hallucination of himself smashing a pickaxe right into the middle of it. It's a little bit violent. Anyway, next she saw him and she took him. Next day he arrived early and now he gets to speak to her. He did not look at her. He unpacked his tray, began eating. And a week had gone by since she'd first approached him. She would have changed her mind. She must have changed her mind. It was impossible that this affair would end successfully. Such things did not happen in real life. He might have flinched altogether from speaking if at this moment he had not seen Ampleforth, the hairy-eared poet, coming into the room. In a low murmur, Winston began speaking, and neither of them, "What time do you leave work?" 18:30. "Where can we meet?" "Victory Square, near the monument." "It's full of telescreens." There you go, back to back. There they are. That's the two of them. Talking with their backs turned. It's full of telescreens. It doesn't matter if there's a crowd. Any signal? No. Don't come up to me until you see me among a lot of people, and don't look at me. Just keep somewhere near me. What time? 19 hours. All right. And then he goes there. And where does he go? To a statue of a man on horseback, which was supposed to represent Oliver Cromwell, the Republican, Puritan, anti-monarchist. There's a little bit of rebellion in his heart. He goes right up by Cromwell. 5 minutes later, the girl had not appeared, and he's fearful, and he hears the sounds of St. Martin's bells chiming and ringing, and there's a discussion between them. "Can you hear me?" "Yes." "Can you get Sunday afternoon off?" "Yes." "Then listen carefully. You'll have to remember this. Go to Paddington Station." Then she gives him a whole series of directions about what to do. "Can you do this?" And they decide to meet up together. Oh, then is chapter 2. So this is the beginning of part 1. All right, of book part 2, chapter 1. So now we get the confrontation, but the confrontation comes at the moment of hope. The hope that has led him to step out and has given him a sense of life and a future at odds with the totalitarian direction of Big Brother and the party. And that's enough to give hope to the reader. It's enough. And then as the story grows over part 2, they meet in a field, and then eventually it leads to more frequent meetings, and they arrange to meet upstairs in a shop. And they get bolder and bolder, the two of them. Comment or question again?
So would you say freedom equals hope or hope equals freedom in this story?
Freedom equals?
Hope or hope equals freedom?
No, I wouldn't say that. Again, equals is a definition. This is that. I would say that freedom, any sense of freedom, gives rise to a sense of hope.
If I can comment on that.
Please.
Just like he's talking with like an analogy of freedom. Like he is living in this senseless society, emotionless society where you do what you're told, and then all of a sudden now because of this woman, which for the sake of argumentation we'll call it freedom, all of a sudden he regains that sense of humanity or hope. And so therefore it's almost for me possible to not think that that image of that woman is freedom or hope.
Well, she represents something too. That's very good in some ways, very thoughtful. She has a symbolic significance to him. And in some ways, she is the personal representation of things that go beyond an attractive young woman. There's more to her than that. She represents more to that, and like he has given her that significance. And I think you're correct. Like it's not, and that's what makes it persuasive to the reader as well. Like if it were just, ooh, she's hot, and there's some like that doesn't really move the reader to want to invest their hopes in this encounter. It's because she symbolizes something greater that where our hopes are raised. Now, what is for the reader discouraging, I would say, is after a while it becomes apparent that it's a little less hopeful than we thought, and it's a little bit more sexual, especially on her part. She seems not to share his enthusiasm for the possibility of being emancipated from the ever-watching eyes of Big Brother. You know, he talks, and he's hoping that he will meet in her somebody committed to freedom in the way that he is. And what he finds is actually, nah, he's just a lover, and she's had others before. And he's disappointed. Not because she's had other lovers, but because she doesn't symbolize what he thought she symbolized. No? Is that not? That's how I read it. He seems disappointed in her. He carries on, but there's a sense of disenchantment in the encounter that was there at the beginning. And so there's a sense even in that he hasn't found the solution to his original problem of feeling trapped and enslaved. And again, Orwell is, in a sense, getting our hopes up and then dashing them. Yes?
Going off of what you're saying and continuing the idea that she represents freedom, would it be then because we argue that the people that live in that society suffer from Stockholm syndrome, so they already fell in love with the oppression, they already know that, and that is their new nature. Since they got so used to freedom, now that sense of life that came back to them, once they got that freedom, since they got used to it, it's not there anymore.
It's very hard to break out of that sort of conditioning that comes from Stockholm syndrome. It's an abusive victim response to a loss of freedom and agency in the situation, which traps people psychologically in a condition that they're now no longer in. Like they've been removed from their jailer, and yet the mindset of being in that situation remains with them afterwards, and they want to go back to it in some ways, and they don't want to be told that they were abused. They don't want. She shows no signs of that. She's not a Stockholm syndrome person. She laughs at Big Brother, thinks that Big Brother is ridiculous in some ways, but she doesn't actually. She's just, quite frankly, she's a contemptible character. She doesn't seem to have higher aspirations. She doesn't believe in the propaganda of Big Brother, and she'll go along with it to save her own life, but she doesn't actually want anything beyond the sexual encounter. That's it. And that's disappointing to him on a different level. So it's almost like a subplot between the two of them. There's Winston Smith against Big Brother, David against Goliath, as it were. And then there's the possibility of a romantic encounter, though, that will give him hope for a freedom that will take him outside the conditions that have been set for him by the totalitarian state of Big Brother. Yes, and she represents all of that. But when she actually engages with him, it's clear, actually, she's not going to give him that. And so I think he's a little bit disappointed, to put it mildly. And it's not that he becomes less heroic, but we lose a little bit of hope as the reader in the process. Or am I wrong? Well, I'm not wrong, but you have a different way of seeing it there. That's my sense in reading it. There's disappointment, because there was a great deal of hope invested in her at first, that the two of them together might be able to be the Adam and Eve that are going to be able to act collectively to find other people of their ilk and mount a counterfight. When they were individuals, they were hopeless, but now that they're together, maybe these risk takers are willing to do something more than just what brought them together. And she has no interest in that whatsoever. So he's back in the same situation he was before, except that he's exposed himself to this terrible risk. And as we'll see, or as you know from having read it, they're already set up in the trap. And by renting the apartment above the bookshop, they're just being watched. Now, she's not been planted there. She's not a honey trap. Like as in Big Brother didn't set her up to do this, but she will very happily betray him if she fears the consequences for herself of this. And what he's going to have to do is do the same with her. He's going to have to be willing to betray something that he loves, because the demand of the party for total allegiance and obedience is absolute. It demands total worship. And that's competition. If he won't betray her, he loves her more than the state. So he has to betray her, as she betrayed him. And they use different means. And one of them is fear, like Room 101, the thing you most fear in the world. That's what's in Room 101. Well, what is that? Nightmare scenario. So the totalitarianism that is there is obvious. I should say also that there is a sort of a class struggle depicted in 1984. There are three social classes. There is an elite inner party, probably representing like the Communist Party. Like in the Soviet Union, I think it's the same in Communist China as well. There are party members. Not everybody in China is part of the Communist Party. It's a smaller grouping, a much smaller grouping. They have an inner status, and they get privileges that come with being in the inner ring of the party. And so that's there in Big Brother as well in 1984. There's the inner political party, And then there's the outer party that is industrious and works with them. And Winston Smith and this woman are part of that, the outer party. And then there's the third element, and those are the proles, the proletariat, the common people. And when Winston reads Goldstein's book, which we get in part 2, he learns that the history of humankind has been this struggle between these three groups, between the proles, that is the working classes, the middle classes, or what Marx calls the bourgeoisie, and the aristocrats, or the leaders. Now, that reading of that is a Marxist reading of history, which we only get because that's what Orwell himself believes is the nature of human history. It's not a biblical account. It's not a non-Marxist account. It's a pure Marxist account of human history that Orwell happens to ascribe to, and he gives it to Goldstein to pen here. Marx and Engels will write that. So there's a class struggle going on, and what these two want to do is they long to be in the presence of the proles. The proles are not, interestingly, the proles are not propagandized in the same way. They seem to have a lot more freedom. They even have families. The party's not really concerned with them. It seems most concerned, the elite is concerned with controlling these characters, the middle classes. And Orwell is making a commentary about the educated middle classes and the way that they are serving an agenda which is probably hostile even to them. But they think that they're on the side of the party that's ruling, and so they carry on with it. So there's a critique there on Orwell's part, I think. And they control all of reality, as we've already seen. Now, their relationship, the sexual relationship, is policed. And the reason it's policed is that sexual frustration, at least this is what Julia says. She says that frustration can be used to drive people into war, and they could overthrow the party. So it has to be controlled. People's desires need to be controlled and manipulated and absolutely regulated. So you can't choose to act on your own. The party has to approve and arrange the relationships. And when they do make love, they think of it as a political act, or at least Winston does, but both of them do to some degree. They call, and here's a direct quote, they call it a blow struck against the party. It's liberation. So there's a lot of strangeness, and even the red sash around her waist suggests there's this, like, a lot of Freudian strange ideas that Orwell is promoting here that I think are a little bit weird and delusional, but are very much part of his socialistic view of human nature. And that's how he depicts it. So they think the way Orwell himself thinks about the situation there. And as their sexual act is an act against the party. And maybe it is. If it's total control, then it probably is. But as an act, it's not particularly effective in overthrowing the government or the bureaucracy. Anyway, other comments or questions here? Yes, go again, Emily. Yes. Yes. So the LGBT movement is part of identity politics, and identity politics are part of cultural Marxism. and it's just the sexualized component of cultural Marxism. So rather than the bourgeoisie against the leaders and the working classes being exploited by the factory owners, as Marx conceives it, it gets pushed into the realm of sexual politics. And these are just another group that joins the working men and working classes as one of the oppressed minority groups. And they conceive of their emancipation from that oppression through the use of their own sexual desires. It's a form of emancipation. They actually explicitly will talk about it in those terms, right? That we're humanizing ourselves through the act of sexual expression or whatever. And in each case, it's a humanly created construct that begs the question, and this is one we're going to need to talk over your whole time at Tyndale. What does it mean to be a human being? And what is what is it when we say that we have human rights, or what is a human being, and what's the right context for human nature, and how does that relate to other people? So we have individual human nature, we understand that, but how does that relate to the family? Because everyone comes from a family. Where do families fit into the LGBT agenda? Where do they fit into the Marxist agenda? In the Marxist conception, the family is something to be done away with. It needs to be controlled. But the same thing in the LGBT thing. We want to control the family. We can redefine the family. It can be two people, and now they don't need to be sexual complementary opposites. It can be two of the same sex, or it can be multiple partners. And they can have whatever identities they want, and we'll call that a family. Okay, so it brings into the whole notion of individual human nature, and again, family, and again, how does the family unit relate to political power? All of those issues are raised in 1984 and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Like, let's rethink this then, because are we right in thinking of ourselves solely as individuals? That's how the Enlightenment encouraged people to think. We're rational, individual, autonomous agents. Is the Enlightenment correct in its assertion of human autonomy? The answer is clearly no. It is wrong. It's totally wrong. So you can't fix the problem of autonomy by sexualizing it. That's not going to cut it. It's not adequate. It's going to be an endless proliferation of letters, well beyond the alphabet. I mean, there's now, I don't even know how many hundreds that are officially recognized, and you can't even know them all, and yet you're supposed to acknowledge them and whatever, and think, I don't even understand what that is. And you're asking me to speak of you being the second person who I address directly, and use a third personal pronoun, and yet, which is what I would do about you when I was speaking to somebody else. I would say, well, she's saying this. Well, that's an impersonal. I'm referring to you to somebody else. So it's not the way you speak to somebody directly. I'd say, well, she says this, but I'm speaking to that person. But you want me to call you she? It's policing language, but it's distorting the personal. I'm making a person into a thing by talking about them in the third person, in the abstraction, as if I'm not speaking to them as a person. A lot of twistedness going on there. So the recovery of human identity is one of the issues that Orwell's 1984 raises. How do we recover human identity in a totalitarian age? I'm going to have to leave it at that because we're out of time and I've overshot my time limit.